Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartia, and welcome to our special episode of Let's Talk for KubeCon EU. And today we have with us two guests from Stark and Wayne, Brian Sugan, Chief Operating Officer, and James Hunt, Director of Research and Development. Brian, James, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Swap.
Thank you, Swap.
James, you are kind of regular on the show. Brian, this is your debut. I want to, if you look at Stark and Wayne, traditionally you folks have been a Cloud Foundry powerhouse there. So before we talk about this topic, I want to understand how do you see Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes? We have talked about that a couple of times, but I want to repeat the message again and again that it's not about CF versus Kubernetes. It's always Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry. So let's start there.
I think Cloud Foundry solved one of the biggest problems facing application developers, and Kubernetes solved one of the biggest problems facing operations staff. So when I talk to customers and when I talk to people in the industry, we talk about, is Cloud Foundry going to give way to Kubernetes? And I don't think it is. We very much believe in a better together story where you're using Kubernetes where it makes sense, and you're using Cloud Foundry where it makes sense, both with an eye towards increasing velocity for deployment, delivery, and other things that start with D.
We're actually seeing a lot of customers move away from Cloud Foundry and go to the Kubernetes route. But along the way, we've seen a number of different lessons learned that they're trying to implement from the Cloud Foundry space into the Kubernetes space. And that's what a lot of our customers have been asking for is how do we kind of mimic some of the best features of Cloud Foundry in the Kubernetes space? And then other customers are still doing the better together story, mostly because it's such a very large cost for them to lift and shift to any other platform at this time.
Right, exactly. And if you look at Cloud Foundry, it has been around for a very long time. Kubernetes is relatively new, not that new though, but still now it has seen people, it's going in production. But there is a contrast that the Cloud Foundry community is very mature. They have been through thick and thin. So they have learned a lot of lessons in their own process. As companies, as organizations, as people are embracing Kubernetes, what are some of the kind of lessons or experiences from Cloud Native world that or approaches that they can bring to Kubernetes so that they can be successful?
Most of these lessons are because, as you mentioned, Cloud Foundry's been around for a while. Kubernetes, a while enough, but not a ton. One of the things that we think the Cloud Foundry community did well was figure out how to standardize a lot of the decisions, the technical decisions, the day-to-day operational, how do you architect this? What does this interface look like? To kind of standardize all of that and take a lot of that decision-making just out of the picture altogether, right? And this stems from the Rails community, which a lot of the early CF people are from Rails, where you have a lot of convention over configuration. So rather than say, here's exactly and explicitly everything I'm going to have you do, it's just kind of understood that services go in a service broker, your applications are pushed as source code. A lot of these things are kind of standard conventions. And we think if you're going to pursue a Kubernetes strategy, one of the best things you can do is standardize first and then evangelize.
It's actually really interesting because what we get brought in to do is work with our customers to figure out what needs to be standardized. What is their development? What is their developers' needs, and how do we kind of federate that across their entire organization, which actually can be a significantly difficult challenge for a lot of the customers that have 100 different application teams.
If you have seen any problem area, gray areas that Kubernetes folks make often, and you're like, hey, just don't do that. Just look at how we have been doing in the Cloud Foundry world.
The biggest thing that I think the Cloud Foundry community did well, the Cloud Foundry, the whole platform, the ecosystem, everything did well was remove the base image question from the mix. So when you do a CF push, for those unfamiliar, you give Cloud Foundry your source code and it compiles it down into a Docker image or an OCI image and then runs that for you on the back-end orchestration platform. Kubernetes brought a lot of flexibility, right, with the image first. You bring your own Docker images, we'll run them on the cloud for you. And that works great until the flexibility becomes too much for very large scale distributed applications teams. So one of the things that we caution most of our Kubernetes customers is to kind of build up a good solid base or a foundation of images that you're going to use. So if you're a big Java shop, build a base Java image that all of your application teams can use to start to build and package their application.
The mistakes in the Kubernetes world is not standardizing enough for their actual application teams, or standardizing the platform enough for their platform teams. What we've been seeing is a lot of different containerized versions out there that doesn't really offer a lot of advantage to the application developer teams in the same way that Cloud Foundry is so standardized that all the application teams are kind of working together in one cohesive unit.
I mean, you don't have to learn the lay of the land when you switch to a different team because they're using Kubernetes a different way.
Do you see any trend within the ecosystem where things are getting standardized? Number one. Number two is that what is contributing to this kind of fragmentation there in the Kubernetes space versus Cloud Foundry? I do remember in the early Cloud Foundry days, there were not enough distributions, but that was a good thing. There are only a few. But in the Kubernetes space, it's more like Linux distribution. There are thousands and millions of them. So talk about what is contributing to this problem of things that are not getting standardized. And then, do you see any movement where things are getting standardized?
That's a really interesting question, especially because it almost are two complete opposite approaches to building the platform, or to how the platform actually got adopted. In the Cloud Foundry space, you had one or two big players. You had, your Pivotal, your IBM, and they were the ones that were the platforms to choose from. A few other smaller players got in there, but nothing that got super wide scale adoption. In the Kubernetes space, it took more of a grassroots approach. You have, hundreds of distributions of Kubernetes. Everybody has their own flavor, their own take, their own way to distribute it out to the customers. And what we've actually seen is, the Kubernetes getting more and more, the Kubernetes distributions getting smaller and smaller. And actually, probably the most significant difference is the IaaS providers and their managed Kubernetes offerings that they have. Cloud Foundry had a really awesome managed Cloud Foundry offering, and that was, the IBM offering. So there was really only one main one. And in the Kubernetes space, all of your main IaaS providers are providing this managed Kubernetes service. And we've actually seen that it get significantly stronger over the past year, to the point where a lot of customers are considering just adopting the managed Kubernetes space of the IaaS provider, whereas that was a lot less common in the Cloud Foundry space.
You mentioned the difference in building community and the difference in building adoption. I think from an engineering perspective, the Kubernetes teams prioritize power and flexibility over ease of use. Whereas the Cloud Foundry teams have always been a more easy to use approach, right? It's if you can't easily push an application to the platform has failed. And one of the unforeseen downsides or outcomes of that is that the Kubernetes managed environments, while they are all, they're certified, they all do the API the right way, but there are small differences that are very deep down in the platform that you don't really notice because the implementers are allowed to do what they want to do. Which means while you do have portability from a GKE to an AKS to an EKS, et cetera, there are different performance characteristics and different things that you as the operator eventually have to deal with that we didn't really get on Cloud Foundry because Cloud Foundry took a very curated approach to the way the whole architecture was put together and the way the whole system worked.
The cloud native Kubernetes world is very, very complicated, very busy space. If you just look at CNC or landscape, there are so many logos. So yes, things do get complicated. So managed services are playing a big role there, and every player has a stake there. But what are the risks of vendor lock-in there? Because whenever we talk about open source, we do have to worry about, people should be able to move from one player to other player. But if you have a very opinionated platform that you're using or, services, you kind of get locked. And you also said, operators, people are leaning towards operators' own managed services. So what are the risks that you see there? Or you're not worried about it?
The biggest risk in that space is where your data lies, right? So one of the awesome things that Cloud Foundry taught everybody is the separation of your data from your application. Honestly, if you control your data, you control your business, really. So as long as you're separating out how you're managing your data. So you're not actually consuming the data services of the actual platform yourself. You're actually building out your data services potentially on the IaaS provider's platform. As long as you have portability of your data, the containerized application can be ported out to any other cloud.
Yes, the interesting thing to me about the vendor lock-in is I don't think as many people are worried about vendor lock-in as they used to be. I've seen this over the last probably 18 months. More and more people willingly and joyfully drinking the Kool-Aid of Amazon and GCP, primarily because over the last, it's been 15 years AWS has been around, there has been no massive price hike, which is usually the number one most easy to discuss risk in any vendor lock-in is what happens if they decide they're going to charge me up 500%. So we haven't seen that. And a lot of the offerings that make the developers more productive and make the applications easier to put together and bring to market are backed by open source software. So when you look at something like Amazon RDS, right? To Brian's point, if I can get the data out of RDS, I have other places that I can run MySQL or Postgres. If I'm using a key value store, it's most likely something similar to Redis, or it's a NoSQL solution like Mongo, and I can easily export my data and move if I need to. And I think it's that threat or that risk to the vendor that their customers may at any point pick up stakes and move that has kept the pricing down and has kept the whole of the ecosystem amenable to being locked in. Not having to build everything from scratch and being able to rely on the IaaS is actually a huge multiplier for very small teams. Where we see most of the multi-cloud strategies actually in the enterprises, where they're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in spend, where shaving 5% off is actually a fairly big boon.
As you're talking about, of course, when we do talk about cloud native, it looks like a rosy picture, but there may be a lot of hard truths. When people move to cloud, they embrace cloud native platforms, they are in for a shock too. Have you had that kind of experiences with your customers where they were not? They're like, hey, I thought it was all bed of roses.
I think the biggest shock to every single customer is that cloud native and being cloud native requires a cultural change. And it's not just a cultural change on the actual technical team. It's a cultural change across the entire organization. Finance has to view things differently. They have to view how they cost things differently. Accounting has to budget for software differently. Even HR has to hire differently because they have to have this whole new world of skill sets that they have to understand and have to also think outside the box when trying to recruit or even just outsource different projects, right? Also procurement, who is used to, being the center for negotiating all of these different contracts, has to collaborate with all of the technical teams to gather the information that they need to get the leverage to negotiate with the customers. So it's actually a huge company-wide effort. I think that's probably the hardest thing for a lot of these customers to understand. It's also the hardest thing to change inside of an organization.
I would say from a technical front, people need to look at cloud native technologies as yet another abstraction, right? That IaaS service that you're using for message brokering, that's an abstraction over you not having to make the decisions on how that gets put together. But as you add more abstractions to any technical solution, the complexity goes way up. And cloud native, you mentioned the landscape from the CNCF, that is a massive smorgasbord of abstractions that you can just pick and choose and put in your Kubernetes and your engines and all this other stuff. And each one of them is going to bring more complexity, which is going to drive up the overall complexity, and the technical debt is going to skyrocket if you're not careful. So we do spend a lot of time advising customers on which roads to take and which things to build themselves and which things to not decompose into microservices, because as you said, it's a rosy picture of, wow, if we just move to the cloud, everything's great. Except there are a lot of beasts and demons in that complexity.
And earlier, as you were mentioning that, what is really important is data. Then you don't have to worry about it. Can you talk about how should users approach data services, especially in the Kubernetes world, to not only kind of break any potential vendor lock-in, but even if you look at data services, first of all, there are a lot of players who are offering their own data services. Then you're also plugging into so many different things for data. So talk about that aspect.
That's actually one of my favorite parts of Cloud Foundry. So Cloud Foundry pioneered the Open Service Broker API. And basically said, let's not think of data services as something that the application owner needs to worry about. And let's think of it more as a marketplace of offerings. And those offerings are handled by brokers that go out and build out instances on demand. So instead of thinking of your relational database as something that the data team manages, that you have to put in, paperwork, some tickets, and some other stuff, justification, use cases, and all that, and then wait 2 weeks for the hardware to get installed or the software to get updated or the licensing to get modified. Why not have a system where the application developer can come in and pick from a menu of different data services? I would like this in a medium form factor, shared is good enough, and then you give me the creds, and I'll go off and use it in my application. The change that engendered in the application texture was amazing to watch, because people all of a sudden started writing their applications to be pluggable with other compatible data services. So if you didn't like the way this MySQL provider did it, you could just switch to another MySQL provider. Or if you're a platform team, you can do the opposite. You can say, we always have this, well, I'll use MySQL again, we always have this MySQL service, but this year we're going to swap out the Oracle MySQL backends for the open source MariaDB backends. And by decoupling the actual service running from the application, we don't have to bother the application developers. And to the point made earlier about decoupling your data from a portability standpoint across clouds, you can also decouple it from the implementation inside a single cloud.
Brian, James, thank you so much for talking about this topic today and bringing your experience from the Cloud Foundry world to the Kubernetes space. And I look forward to talk to you folks again. So thank you.
Look forward to see you again soon, Swap.
Thank you so much for having us.